Welcome to the Deep Dive. Really glad you could join us today. This is a really key part of our CSWIP 3.1 exam prep series. We're aiming this right at you to help you get ready for that CSWIP 3.1 Welding Inspector Exam.
Our mission.
Pretty straightforward, cackle some multi-choice questions. But, it's not just about getting the answer right. It's about really getting the ideas behind them. We want you walking away feeling, confident and ready. Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah, and that unpacking is really where the value lies. Look, for a welding inspector who really knows their stuff, it's never just memorizing answers. It's truly understanding the why. That's what lets you spot problems out in the field, maybe even before they happen, and make sure things are safe and sound. So as we go through these, try to think along with us, really engage with the concepts. It helps build that deeper picture.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. Right then, let's dive into our first one. This question takes us into the world of steel metallurgy, how steel holds up when things get hot. So here's the first question for you. Which of the following elements help and improve creep properties at elevated temperature in steel and sun? And your options are A, tungsten.B, manganese.C, molybdenum.D, carbon. Okay, take a second. Which one helps steel resist that slow stretching under heat and stress? What do you think?
The correct answer is C, molybdenum. And knowing why is really fundamental here. So creep properties, what does that mean? Basically, it's a material's tendency to sort of slowly deform permanently when it's under stress for a long time, especially at high temperatures. Think about something like a turbine blade in a jet engine, right? It's spinning fast under huge stress and it's incredibly hot. If it didn't have good creep resistance, it would slowly stretch out over time, and that could be catastrophic. Molybdenum, or malavely as it's often called, really boosts steel's ability to resist this. How? Well, a couple ways. First, it kind of strengthens the steel's basic crystal structure, makes it harder for atoms to move around and deform. Second, and this is key at high temps, molybdenum forms these very stable carbides compounds of molybdenum and carbon. These little carbides don't break down easily, even when it's really hot. They act like tiny anchors inside the steel, stopping the grains from sliding past each other, which is what causes creep. Without molybdenum, the steel will just give way much sooner under that kind of stress.
That's fascinating. So molybdenum is like the secret ingredient for high temp strength.
Yeah.
But it makes you wonder, why isn't it in all steel then? Are there downsides? Like, does it affect other things?
That's a really good question. And it gets into the whole art of designing alloys. Molybdenum definitely improves creep resistance, no doubt, but it also adds cost. And it can affect other properties too, like how easy it is to weld, or maybe its ductility if you don't balance it right with everything else in the mix. It's always a trade-off, really. Tailoring the material for the specific job, balancing the performance you need against the cost, and, how easy it is to actually make something with it. It's not just theory. This is why critical parts like turbine blades or boiler tubes don't just fail after years of heat and stress. It's materials science in action, right down at the atomic level.
Incredible. Okay, so molybdenum helps the steel itself, but then you've got to join these materials, right? Welding, and welding brings its own set of, challenges, like protecting that molten metal. Which leads us nicely to question 2. This one's about a specific welding process and the gas it uses. In which of the following welding process carbon dioxide gas is used? Your options: A, GMAW, B, MMAW, SMMA, DSOT. All right, which process often uses CO2 as its shielding gas?
Okay, the correct one here is a GMAW. That stands for gas metal arc welding, sometimes called MIG welding, though that technically implies an inert gas. GMAW is super common. You've got a continuous wire feeding through, and crucially, a shielding gas flowing around it to protect the weld area. And carbon dioxide, CO2, is a very popular choice for that shielding gas in GMAW. Sometimes pure CO2, often mixed with argon. So why CO2? Well, unlike argon, which is inert, CO2 is actually a reactive gas. That means it sort of gets involved in the arc chemistry. When you use it, especially with certain transfer modes like short circuit, it tends to give you really good penetration into the base metal. That's a big plus for thicker stuff. What happens is the CO2 breaks down in the hot arc into carbon monoxide and oxygen. This reaction actually helps stabilize the arc and makes the weld pool hotter, which improves fusion, gives you a strong weld. Now, the downside is it can sometimes produce a bit more spatter than, say, pure argon, but it's cheap and gives great penetration, so it's a real workhorse in industry. Just quickly on the others, MMAW, stick welding, uses the flex on the electrode for shielding, no external gas. GTT, or TIG welding, needs super clean weld, so it uses inert gases like argon or helium, definitely not CO2. And CSWW, submerged arc welding, hides the arc under a blanket of granular flux. Again, no gas needed there.
Got it. That's a clear difference. And it's interesting, isn't it, how that reactive CO2 gives you the penetration, kind of a trade-off with the spatter sometimes. You mentioned spatter.
Yeah.
Is that just something you live with when using CO2 and GMAW, or have things improved? Like, can technology help reduce it?
Yeah, that's a fair point. Spatter is kind of inherent with high CO2 levels in GMAW, but yes, definitely technology has helped. Things like pulsed welding techniques, where the current is rapidly switched on and off, can really minimize spatter. Also, the specific chemistry of the welding wire and really advanced power sources that give much finer control over the arc characteristics, they all play a part. But yeah, in many high-speed, high-production settings, a bit of spatter is often still seen as an acceptable price for the cost savings and the deep penetration you get with CO2.
Makes sense. Okay, let's shift gears slightly. Still in materials, but looking at a different property. Magnetism. Most steels stick to a magnet, right? But not all alloys do. This next question is about one of those exceptions. Which of the following alloys is non-magnetic? And the choices are A, 4% chromium molybdenum, B, 12% chromium down, C, austenitic stainless steel, D, 9% nickel steel. So which one of these stands out as being non-magnetic?
All right, the answer is C, austenitic stainless steel. This one catches people out sometimes because, steel means iron and iron means magnetic usually. But austenitic stainless steels, the common 300 series like 304 or 316, they are indeed non-magnetic at room temperature. The reason? It boils down to their atomic structure and what's in them. These stainless steels have quite a bit of nickel and chromium added. The high nickel content is really the key here. It stabilizes what's called the austenite phase of the steel. Now, austenite has a specific crystal structure, face-centered cubic, or FCC. Imagine atoms at each corner of a cube and one in the middle of each face. This FCC structure is fundamentally different from the structures in most magnetic steels, like ferritic, body-centered cubic, BCC, or martensitic. In simple terms, the way the atoms are arranged in that FCC structure, along with the electron configuration thanks to the nickel and chromium, means their tiny magnetic fields effectively cancel each other out. No overall magnetism. The other options, like the chrome moly steel or the 12% chromium steel, they typically have ferritic or martensitic structures. They're magnetic. Even the 9% nickel steel, while high in nickel, often ends up with a structure that is magnetic or can become magnetic if it gets very cold. So yeah, austenitic stainless steel is the odd one out here.
That's brilliant. So it's literally the way the atoms are stacked.
Yeah.
And being non-magnetic, that's not just a party trick, is it? I mean, where does that property become really important in the real world? What kind of applications rely on this?
Oh, absolutely critical in loads of places. Think about MRI machines in hospitals. Any magnetic material nearby would totally mess up the scan. So lots of components in and around them are made from austenitic stainless steel, or sensitive scientific instruments, some electronics, even things like architectural fittings where you don't want magnetic dust sticking, or parts in particle accelerators. Anywhere that magnetic interference is a problem, or where you need a material that won't become magnetized. It's a really valuable property.
Fascinating stuff. Okay, so we've got our materials, our processes, but things don't always go perfectly. Defects happen. And knowing which defects are more likely with which process is vital for an inspector, which leads to our next question. Which of the following defects is more common to weld deposited by CO2 welding than welds deposited by MMA? And the options: A, slag inclusions; B, excess penetration; C, lack of sidewall fusion; D, tungsten inclusions. Okay, think about CO2 welding, like the GMAW, versus MMA or stick welding. Which defect is more typical for the CO2 process?
The answer we're looking for here is C, a lack of sidewall fusion. And this is a really serious one. It means the weld metal hasn't properly bonded, hasn't fused, with the side of the joint, the base metal. It basically leaves a built-in crack or weakness right at the edge of the weld. Act as a stress riser. Not good at all for the strength of the joint. Now, why is this more common in CO2 welding, which, as we said, is usually GMAW? Well, sometimes with GMAW, especially if you're trying to weld fast using higher wire speeds, maybe with a shorter arc, the arc might not spread out enough, might not wash onto the sidewalls properly if the heat input isn't quite right, or maybe the welder's technique, the torch angle isn't perfect. The molten metal can just sort of bridge the gap without actually melting into and fusing with that cooler base metal on the side. It looks like it's joined, but it hasn't really bonded underneath. Visually, you might see a little groove, or maybe it needs NDT, like ultrasonics, to find it properly. Compare that to MMA, stick welding. A really common issue there is slag inclusions. Because you've got all that flux melting, it can get trapped if you're not careful, especially between weld passes. And tungsten inclusions, well, that's specific to GTIW, TIG welding, if the tungsten electrode accidentally touches the weld cool. So yeah, lack of sidewall fusion, definitely something to be vigilant about when inspecting CO2 GMAW welds.
Right. That makes perfect sense. It's like the weld metal just sits there without properly biting into the sides. And that seems like a really critical thing for an inspector to catch. You mentioned NDT might be needed, but does that mean it's often hard to spot just by looking?
It can be, yes. Sometimes it's quite obvious, like a clear groove along the weld toe, but other times, especially if it's intermittent or just below the surface, it might look okay visually, but the fusion just isn't there underneath. That's why understanding the process, knowing where to look, and sometimes relying on NDT methods like UT or radiography is so important for ensuring weld integrity, especially for critical applications. You can't just assume it's okay because the surface looks smooth.
Vital information. Okay, let's tackle our last question for this deep dive. This one goes right back to basics, a fundamental concept. What is the primary function of a shielding gas in welding? Options are A, to provide light during the welding process, B, to protect the weld from atmospheric contamination, C, to cool down the welding equipment, D, to remove impurities from the base materials. Okay, this one feels foundational. What's the main job, the number one reason we use shielding gas?
The primary function, the absolute core reason, is B, to protect the weld from atmospheric contamination. And this is like welding 101, but it's so critical. Think about it. When you melt metal in the arc, it's incredibly hot and it becomes very reactive. It wants to grab onto things from the air around it. The air is mostly nitrogen and oxygen, right? If those gases get into the molten weld pool, they cause all sorts of problems. Oxygen reacts to form oxides, which can get trapped to make the weld weak and brittle, causes porosity too. Nitrogen can make the steel brittle, cause porosity, even lead to cracking later on. Both really degrade the mechanical properties, the strength, the toughness of the weld, makes it unreliable. So the shielding gas, whether it's argon, CO2, its main job is to push the air away. It creates this protective bubble and envelope around the arc and the molten pool. It physically blocks the oxygen and nitrogen from getting into contact with that super hot reactive metal while it melts and solidifies. Sure, some gases might affect the arc stability or the heat or how clean the weld looks, like we talked about with CO2. Those are secondary effects. But the number one non-negotiable job is protection from the atmosphere. Without that protection, most of the arc welding processes we rely on just wouldn't produce sound, strong welds.
Right. So what does this all mean? It means that simple flow of gas is absolutely fundamental. It's the invisible shield that makes modern welding possible and reliable. Understanding that isn't just trivia. It's key to understanding weld quality and preventing failures.
Okay, wow. You've just powered through a deep dive into some really crucial concepts for your CSWIP 3.1 exam. We tackled creep resistance, shielding gases, non-magnetic materials, common defects, the works. Hopefully you're feeling more confident now, not just knowing the answers, but really grasping why they're the answers. That's the goal here.
Exactly. And I really hope you see how these things connect. It's not just isolated facts. Understanding molybdenum's role helps you understand material selection. Knowing about shielding gas helps you understand GMAW defects. It's all linked. Keep thinking about those connections and maybe visualize these processes. That holistic view is what builds true expertise.
Well said. And here's a final thought to take away with you. As you keep studying and as you eventually get out there working as a welding inspector, just think about how these principles, material science, defect awareness, process control, they aren't just exam topics. They are literally what holds our world together safely. Bridges, pipelines, power plants. Your knowledge protects all of that every single day. It's a huge responsibility, and understanding these fundamentals is where it all starts.